In this video, we're going to talk about solving quadratic equations by completing the square. We've already talked about factoring and taking the square root. However, only some quadratic equations can be solved that way. Not all quadratic equations can be solved that way. All quadratic equations can be solved using completing the square and the quadratic formula. If they have a solution at all. Okay? So here we're going to look at completing the square. And you've probably already done this. Write down an example of a perfect square and explain why it is a perfect square. Well, 4, 16, 25 are all perfect squares. And it's because 2 squared is 4, 4 squared is 16, and 5 squared is 25. That's a perfect square. We also have something called a perfect square trinomial, which has a similar idea. An x squared plus 6x plus 9 is a perfect square trinomial. And it's because x plus 3 squared equals x squared plus 6x plus 9. And notice that the square root of 9, the last number here, is 3, and that 6 divided by 2, the middle number, is also 3. So, is x squared minus 8x plus 16 a perfect square trinomial? And the answer is yes, it is. Because if I take just this hint that we had up here, the square root of 16 is 4 plus or minus 4. You can get plus 4 or minus 4 there. Okay? And negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. So because that's true, this is yes, and it would look like x minus 4 squared. X minus 4 squared. That's a perfect square trinomial. So let's look at, what about x squared minus 2/3 x plus 9? Well, a quick way to tell is let's take negative 2/3 divided by 2. That would be negative 1/3. Now, the square root of 1 over 9 is just the square root of 1 over the square root of 9, which is 1 over 3, but of course it could be plus or minus 3, and since there's this and this, they're both there, they're both negative 1/3, so yes, it is. And it would look like x minus 1/3 squared. A little bit messy, not our favorite thing to have it that way, but it's right. Okay? Now, when we solve by completing the square, we're going to take a quadratic trinomial that's not a perfect square trinomial, and we're going to make it into one that is. Okay? So, here's what we do. Here's the steps, and then we'll go through a couple examples together. All right, completing the square. All right, the first thing is put the equation in x squared plus bx equals c form. Okay? And then we are going to add b divided by 2 squared to both sides, making the left side a perfect square trinomial, which is what we were after. Then we're going to factor into x plus b over 2 squared. Just the left side only. We're not going to mess with the right side on that step. Just the left side. We're going to factor it into that. And then we're going to square root both sides. And solve. Those are our steps that we're going to use, okay, to make ours into perfect square trinomials and solve with that. All right, so let's look at some examples here. All right, we're going to use a technique called word it out, work it out. And we want to solve x squared minus 8x plus 11 equals 0. And what we're going to do on the one side, we're going to write out the step that we're doing, and on the other side, we're actually going to do the math. That's word it out, work it out. Okay. So our first step, we learned from above, our first step is to put the equation into x squared plus bx equals c form. Well, this is almost in that form, except that it's not. We got a plus 11 here, so all I have to do is subtract 11 from both sides, and I get x squared minus 8x equals negative 11. Now it's in that form. Next step is to add b over 2 squared to both sides. Well, b over 2 would equal negative 8 in this case over 2, which is negative 4, and negative 4 squared is 16. That negative 4 is going to be important to us in our next step. So what I want to do here is I want to add 16 to both sides of the equal sign. And notice I'm allowed to do that because as long as I do the same thing to both sides, I can do pretty much anything I want. There are some exceptions, but I can pretty much do what I want. I added 16 to both sides. That does not change whether the equation's true or not. It's still true. Now what we've done by doing that is we have taken this and made it into a perfect square trinomial. In fact, one that we've already seen back here, x squared minus 8x plus 16, and we knew that it was x minus 4 squared. So let's go back, and that's where this negative 4 comes from, and this is where we want to factor into x minus b over 2 squared. So this becomes that x minus 4 squared. That's an important step because that step allows us to solve this equation. And on the other side, negative 11 plus 16 is 5. So now I can square root both sides. And we will solve as well. So 4 and 5 here. Square root both sides, so we take the square root of x minus 4 squared equals the square root of 5. And this would be the square root and the square cancel each other out, so this would be x minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 5. Add 4 to both sides, 4 plus or minus the square root of 5. And for now you can leave your answers like that. You can always put the two answers into your calculator, which would obviously be 4 plus the square root of 5 and 4 minus the square root of 5 if you want a decimal answer. That's how we do completing the square. But let's look at another example. Okay? So we're going to do the same thing. Word it out, work it out. Same steps. We first want to put into x squared plus bx equals c form. So just like last time, we're going to add, we've got 2x squared plus 14x. We're going to add 6 to both sides, so we have that. However, we're not quite into that form yet because this does not have a 2 in front of it. Over here we have the 2. We have to get rid of that 2. It has to just be x squared by itself. The coefficient has to be 1. So I'm going to divide everything by 2, and I get x squared plus 7x equals 3. Now I have it in that x squared plus bx equals c form. Okay. So the next step was we add b over 2 squared to both sides. We know b over 2 in this case would equal 7 over 2, which is 3.5, and 3.5 squared is 12.25. Now, we're going to add that to both sides. So x squared plus 7x plus 12.25 equals 3 plus 12.25. Now we want to factor into x plus b over 2 squared. So this side, the b over 2, remember, b over 2 is that 3.5. So it's x plus 3.5 squared equals, and 3 plus 12.5 plus 12.25 is 15.25. Now I'm ready to take the square root and solve. So I would take the square root of this. So I have x plus 3.5 equals plus or minus the square root of 15.25, and then subtract 3.5 from both sides. And I have this. And again, you can leave your solution like that and put it in your calculator, get an answer for yourself if you want. Okay. That is how we do completing the square.